Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name's Katie Castagna, and I'm the President and CEO for United Way, Monterey County. United Way fights for the financial stability of everybody in Monterey County. And we know that we cannot win that fight without addressing the need for access to affordable housing. I'm so pleased to be welcoming you to the third session of our Accessory Dwelling Unit Conference. This one is geared toward designers and builders. Over the past 24 hours, we've had very informative sessions geared toward homeowners and advocates. We've taken a deeper dive into the financing of ADUs, and we've talked about coalition building and heard from Habitat for Humanity about some of the new local opportunities for ADU expansion. Interest in our workshops has been strong. We've had well over 100 registrants just for this session alone. Several hundred over the course of these 3 days are involved in this conversation about ADUs in Monterey County. I'd also like to recognize Kelly DeWolf, the Impact Associate for Affordable Housing with United Way, who's done an excellent job in pulling all of this together and working with our many partners to make it happen. Kelly will be managing the question and answer session during the Zoom conference, and I'm going to encourage you to enter any questions that you have into that, and you'll be hearing from Kelly later on as we get more interactive. I'd also like to thank the many sponsors we have that helped make this possible, including Casivan Architects, Monterey County Association of Realtors, Casivan Construction, Studio Chicotans, Justin Polly Architects, Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, City of Pacific Grove, Monterey Energy Group, Inc., CHISPA, the Paul Davis Partnership, LLP, Workbench, City of Seaside, City of Salinas, City of Gonzales, Salinas Valley Chamber of Commerce, the Central Coast Builders Association, the Monterey County Farm Bureau, the City of Monterey, Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and the Carmel Chamber of Commerce. And now I would like to introduce Doug Yount, Project Director of Community Partners, Marina Community Partners, and he's Chair of the Board of United Way, Monterey County. Welcome, Doug.
Good afternoon. I think, Kelly, you need to turn the video on. But I can start. Or not. Okay, so let me just start. I think hopefully you can hear my voice. Here in Monterey County, United Way's primary mission is to improve the quality of life for individuals and families by ensuring their financial stability. This mission is especially important in these economically challenging times where families, daily lives, the businesses where they work, the schools they attend are all stretched to the limits, dealing with the pandemic, fires, in addition to their normal struggles that these families have. The mission for financial stability is accomplished through three key focus areas, and these are derived from the countywide strategic process of the community impact model. First, affordable child care and early childhood education. Second, financial literacy and asset building. And three, and important to these discussions, affordable housing. ADUs are a key component of affordable housing, often overlooked in their importance and ability to fulfill housing goals for local communities in the region. I am pleased Monterey County, like the state, is now recognizing this strategic component of affordable housing. I'm also pleased that the United Way is helping to facilitate this regional conversation and catalyze the increase in this important portion of the housing supply. Let me now introduce a prominent local architect, Peter Casivan. Peter and I had the pleasure of working together with the City of Salinas on the award-winning economic development element of their general plan. Peter is a third-generation Monterey County resident and the president of Casivan Architects, founded in Salinas in 1949 by his father. Peter bought the company in 1994 and has been responsible for many award-winning buildings, including the Center for Performing Arts at Carmel High School and the Ted Taylor Ag Vocational Center at Rancho Cielo. He was invested as a fellow in the American Institute of Architects in 2017 and serves as the chair of the Governmental Affairs Committee for the AIA Monterey Bay chapter. Peter?
Well, thank you, Doug. I enjoyed working with you on the EDE, which for the record won 3 planning awards. But speaking for the AIA, the American Institute of Architects has been advancing the value of architecture for more than 150 years. With 100 members, the Monterey Bay chapter serves the Tri-County area as the regional voice for the architecture profession. We serve as an educational resource to promote the quality of the built environment and to advocate policies to create prosperous, healthy, and livable communities. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this series of 4 ADU workshops with United Way Monterey County. The AIA also advocates for legislation and policies that streamline the permit review process. In the case of ADUs, that includes recent state legislation that provides relief from many expensive local requirements and eliminates development fees for most ADUs. These laws also require local jurisdictions to include a plan that incentivizes and promotes the creation of accessory dwelling units, and my understanding is those local plans are due at the end of the year. The members of the AIA Monterey Bay understand these local zoning ordinances, building codes, and the state laws affecting the creation of ADUs. Additionally, our members have been recognized with hundreds of awards and can provide beautiful designs that maximize the livability, efficiency, and durability of your project. You can find a list of member architects at the AIAMB website. Just type in the initials AIAMB. So thank you for supporting our workshops. I know you'll find this presentation to be a great resource as you consider the value of pursuing an ADU project. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce Kol Peterson. He's an ADU expert based in Portland, Oregon. He has helped catalyze the exponential growth of ADUs in Portland over the last decade through his ADU advocacy, education, consulting, policy work, and his own entrepreneurship. He is the author of Backdoor Revolution, the definitive guide to ADU development, and he's the owner of Caravan, the first tiny house hotel in the world. And he's an organizer of Portland's popular ADU tour. He consults with homeowners about ADUs on their property and teaches ADU classes for homeowners and for real estate agents in Oregon, in Washington, and California. He edits and manages several websites about ADUs, including accessorydwellingunits.org and buildinganadu.com. Kol developed and lived in a detached new ADU himself and developed a basement garage conversion ADU in 2018. Kol has a master's degree in environmental planning from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And prior to his ADU work, Kol worked in the federal government for 10 years in Washington, D.C. and Portland, Oregon. So it is my pleasure now to introduce Kol Peterson.
All right. Am I there? I'm there. Hey, thanks. And Peter, if you could go ahead and check your chat. I just sent you a question. I was hoping to get your insights on a question that I have pretty early on. Thanks so much. I'm excited to be back, and we're going to launch into kind of a best practices and considerations about designing and building ADUs. But before we get started, I guess we were interested in learning a little bit more about some of the people who are attending today, so that so we have a better sense of who's here. So Kelly, would you mind launching the first poll? Or if you need to become the presenter in order to do so, go for it. And the question we are trying to get at is, you know, who is here today? So you can only, I guess you can select multiple options, but please go ahead and select whichever of the options is best describes you, and then submit your answer, and we'll close that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then Kelly, if you could show the results, that would be great. All right, so we have a lot of design professionals, some building professionals, some homeowners, excellent, and then a smattering of other folks. So that's awesome, great. And then I think we had another question about, was it Kelly, how many ADUs have you been inside?
Oh, I had the question of, have you assisted in building an ADU?
Correct. Okay, next question. So how you assisted in helping Build an ADU, that's the first question, Kelly. Let's go to the second question. All right, so have you helped to develop an ADU as a professional? That means, are you a designer that's helped a homeowner build an ADU? You have 2 seconds. 1, 2. All right, close that one down and show the results. All right, so a lot of people have not yet helped anybody build an EDU. Some people have, that's great. And then if we had a third question, let's go ahead and ask it, which is, I think, how many ADUs have you been inside? Did we get that one written down, Kelly?
I didn't get that one written down.
All right, no worries. Well, why don't you write that one down?
Yeah, I can do that now while you're starting, and you can watch it later.
Okay. So, all right. So, as Peter introduced, I have a lot of a whole different suite of experiences with ADUs. Been in probably more ADUs than anybody else in the country, and I've helped, built to myself. But I always like to caveat every presentation by saying I'm not a designer or builder, and I will probably say things that are not correct. And so I would encourage you to correct me in the chat and tell me where I'm wrong. I have no problem with getting the correct information out there. If you disagree, great, tell us, put it in the chat, ask a question. And we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. And furthermore, on top of that, the California building code is going to be different than what I'm accustomed to. So there's going to be nuances to California code and local interpretation of the ADU code that will make some of the answers that I get, I won't necessarily have all the detailed answers because a lot of this stuff isn't codified yet. And what I mean by that is there's state statute that defines the planning and zoning regulations for what is permissible in terms of ADU development, but it won't get into the level of detail that say the city of Portland's statutes have for how precisely you can locate an electrical panel so that it's accessible to both units. And ultimately, eventually, jurisdictions will have that kind of guidance, but in a city where only a dozen ADUs have been built, they simply won't have that information, and you'll run up against situations consistently, guarantee, where you don't get straightforward answers to questions that you need to know. And you might get contradictory information because this is a pretty new housing form, at least in its legal permitted status. It's a new housing form. And so that's kind of one of the many, challenges that you'll deal with as you go about helping people build ADUs, is getting the right information about them. As Peter alluded to, this book out here is intended to kind of give the best practices from a national perspective, but there's going to be local interpretations of a lot of things that will have to take precedent over, what I say. And so I want to be humble about the fact that what I have to say is, perhaps not going to be 100% accurate, but nonetheless, I have a vast amount of experience relative to most people with ADUs. So I'll probably be able to answer most questions. Okay, with that caveat aside, I'm going to share my, maybe let's ask that last question if Kelly has it done, which was, you want to pull it up if you have it, Kelly? Poll question.
Yep, give me 1 second here.
Next question.
Oh,
How many ADUs have you been inside? Kenneth has been to the ADU tour, so he's probably been to more than anybody on this call besides me. He's designed 14 in his area, so that's great. Okay, so if you answer that question, we'll close this down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's show the results. And most people predictably have been, and we should have said 0 to 3, because most people have never been inside of an ADU, which makes sense because there aren't very many of them. So 1 to 3 is probably indicative of, 0 to 3 actually. And I bet you out of that 1 to 3, most people have been in 0. We should have put that in there. Very few people have been in 10 or more. But if you have, that's great. So here we go. I'm going to go into the presentation mode now and share the screen. Okay. So I'm going to check one more thing before I get going here. Okay. All right. So to begin with, and some of this is a tiny bit redundant of things I went over in the homeowner workshop for people who participate in that, but most of it will not be, 80% will not be. Okay, so when somebody is building an ADU, there's kind of a triangular relationship between these three actors. There's the designer, the builder, and the homeowner. The homeowner is the funder, the executor of the project. They're the ones who are ultimately responsible for initiating and executing the ADU, but equally important in the development of the ADU is the designer and the builder. Theoretically, those three actors can be one person. Very rarely does it happen in practice. So you can theoretically be all three, but I wouldn't say that that's a common thing. I've seen that happen, one time or two times. Most commonly, homeowners are not experienced builders and are incapable of playing that role. And most commonly, homeowners are not architects. However, homeowners oftentimes do heavily inform the design process. And in the case of doing like a simple conversion of an existing structure, such as a garage or attached living space or internal conversion, it's possible for homeowners to do a lot of the design work, and in part because you're not dealing with the more complicated elements of the design, that is to say the structural elements, the load-bearing walls, the engineering calculations, and in terms of doing a floor plan of a pre-existing space, it's not that difficult to put that stuff on a piece of grid paper and figure it out. That said, it's never a bad idea to use a designer, except it costs some money. So if you are a very knowledgeable or very, intuitively design-oriented homeowner, you can theoretically work with a draftsman and a builder and come up with a set of designs without using a designer. A designer, by the way, is a synonymous term with the term architect, except architects have been certified through the state. At least this is how I understood it in Oregon. Maybe Peter can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat window on this. But typically that would mean they passed a state exam, and so they have the architectural license, but they might have the same degree of training as a designer. Somebody who's a designer may have been through years of school to get that, to do that kind of work, but may have never bothered to take an architectural exam at the state. So that is kind of the triangular relationship that you have, and there's oftentimes a tension between the designer and the builder in the process of developing an ADU. If you go through the design build process in a conventional format, which is hire a designer, get a set of plans that you like, and then shop it around to builders, and the builder says, I can do it for this much, and then what you miss in the process of that is getting the builder's input in the design phase, which I think is pretty critical with regard to ADUs, in that builders are heavily knowledgeable about the actual practical details of development. And that is going to be intrinsically important to ADUs because that's going to ultimately affect the cost. ADUs in general are going to serve this middle income bracket of people who own property, but maybe are not super loaded. And so cost is always going to be a factor because homeowners, generally speaking, won't have unlimited cost to spend on these things. And therefore, it's important not to just do this with the eye of doing the most incredible design possible, but rather something that is achievable in reality, which is going to be constrained by budget. And therefore, the builder is going to have a much better handle on the actual building costs of a project scope than anybody, because they're the ones who are ordering the materials on a day-to-day basis. And they know how much things actually cost. They know what the last bid came in for plumbing on their last job, and they know how much wood cost per linear foot today in Home Depot. So all those things mean that the designer, the builder knows a lot more of this granular detail in terms of project costs than anybody would. And so if you want to be able to actually build a project, you want to have their input, not to mention that they have some practical knowledge about the development of a project that would inform the design process. So once you've kind of, in an ideal world, you identify a designer builder at the outset, and then start to hone in the scope of a job with an architect or designer. And that designer would then take the scope that you and the contractor have kind of come up with, that is to say, something like, I think I want to do a 1-bedroom, 650 square foot ADU. Designer, please help me do that. It has to be 1 story. And we want ductless mini split. We want it to be a 1-bedroom. We want it to have wood clad siding. We want to have a shed roof. All the things that you've worked out in conversation with your builder. So there is a process that is kind of a design build process, but it's not a design build company per se. There are also design build companies that do both the design and the construction of a building, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's almost preferable in some ways, in that you get the builder is on the hook for the the designer is on the hook for the execution of the job itself. So they're going to be responsible for not only knowing how to design it well, but also how to execute it within the budget that you have available. So in this context, you might say, okay, I have $200,000 that because I'm getting a construction loan financing, and that's all I'm eligible for. And therefore I need to finish this job, everything included, permits, design, utility connections, turnkey ready for $200,000. Designer, builder, person, company, let's make that happen. How big of a project can I do? What do I want it to look like? And that's kind of a design build company's approach. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great, and it's easier for the homeowner in some ways. The only disadvantage of that is you're not going to get as competitive bids perhaps as you might if you went with shopping around for the best priced builder you could find and the best priced designer. But for the next project that I do, I'm probably going to use like a design build process with basically the design build company in order to make that process kind of seamless. And I haven't done that before. In the past, I've always kind of played the general contractor role as well as being heavily involved with the design. So what I would say as a general piece of advice for homeowners, this isn't for designers and builders per se, but rather for the homeowner, I'd say you want to look for a designer who knows at least as much as you do about ADU codes and loopholes and small space design as you. And what to look for in a general contractor, well, interestingly, I'd say while it doesn't hurt to have ADU building experience, it's not requisite. I think if you're a general contractor who knows how to build a home, you can build an ADU. There's nothing actually different about building an ADU, aside from a couple minor things, than building any other house. And therefore, all you need is a general contractor who can build a house, and a general contractor can build a house. What you would look for in that is somebody who you can afford. So are there costs within alignment with what you can afford based on what you understand the local market cost to be? Do you have good communication? Do you trust them? Do they text you back? Do they call you back when you call them? And do they have good references? These are just kind of tried and true vetting practices. There's nothing special or ADU centric about them, but I think that's the reality of ADU development. It's just a house. It's just a little bit smaller. The only thing that varies or differentiates ADU construction from home construction is the utility connections, and access to the backyard can be constrained because you're building on site. So on site while a homeowner is living there. So in that sense, it's more akin to a home renovation where a homeowner is living on site. There's a little bit of difference there, but that's all the more reason why you want to have a good relationship with the builder. And these are fine places to look for general contractors. I would say word of mouth, neighbors, family, friends, colleagues, people who can refer you to general contractors they've used in the past. I like to say that ADUs lend themselves really well to small-time general contractors, small-time designers, one-person, two-person shops. So that's kind of what I look for personally, but there's a lot of companies out there that are trying to advertise themselves as ADU builders, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So I don't mean to discard the value of that, because there's certainly value to having built ADUs before, but I don't think it's requisite. I wouldn't put it this way. I would not make that an overlay of something that I would require if I was looking for a builder. But these are kind of generally places you could potentially look. You could look on the CCB website to see whether there's any reporting about the general contractors that you're interested. You can look on various websites that rate general contractors. So those are all different ways that homeowners can vet GCs and find them. So these are, three different types of ADUs. This is detached new construction. This is a garage conversion ADU, and this is basement conversion ADU. In terms of some different considerations in terms of contracts for ADU development, I generally, from me talking to a homeowner, I'd say, generally speaking, for new construction, you're going to want to go with a fixed price contract. A fixed price contract is going to be important because these projects are so expensive that you need to know how much it's going to cost. And the disadvantage of a fixed price contract is that you have to be really specific within the contract scope to be clear about what the general contractor is responsible for and what you're responsible for. If you're like me, you want to put in some sweat equity, you want to do the painting, you want to do the flooring, you want to do the whatever, tile work, siding, roofing, whatever it is. And if that's the case, you have to be super clear in the scope of work to determine what elements are on the homeowner's responsibility and what elements are on the general contractor. Things like, say, drywall finish, you want to specify within the scope of work. If you don't, then the general contractor will inherently give the least expensive form of finish that they can. On the drywall, they'll do orange peel drywall finish, which might be fine. But if you're picky and you want smooth drywall finish, then you're going to want to specify that. It's going to cost you more up front, but not as much as having them have to redo the drywall finish because you didn't specify it within the scope of work. Another approach is the time plus materials approach, which is a more flexible contract vehicle. This would be better for smaller ADU conversion budgets. If you're doing a junior ADU, for example, this would probably be more appropriate. If you know that you have sufficient money to do all this job, to do this work, you can just work on an hourly basis, pay a builder whatever it is, 40 bucks an hour, plus materials, and that's a fine approach for smaller jobs. And so those are some thoughts about those two contract vehicles. In general, fixed price contracts are how people are going to go forward with this stuff. If you are going to do a fixed price contract, you might, I'm talking here to homeowners, you might consider doing an allowance for certain elements within your budget. For example, you might say, I am going to select the appliances and the general contractor will be responsible for installing said appliances. Instead of saying, contractor, you will select all appliances and put them in. You could do that, but again, why would a home general contractor then get you stainless steel if that's what you want? Like, if you want that, you have to specify that, and you might not know you want that till you're out there in the store selecting them. So they're going to get you the least expensive fixtures they can, because that would be the most rational thing to do for them. In order to make sure that you as a homeowner are getting the full scope of work completed, you might want to preserve a little bit of money within your payment schedule till the final punch list is completed. You might consider giving an incentive to the builder for finishing the work on time or on budget. So those are some considerations. Lastly, this is a really big project, so it might behoove you to have a lawyer review the contract that you are working off of with the builder. I've never done that myself, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to do so. I'm just going to stop here for a second and see if there's any questions I need to.
Yeah, so there have been a few comments regarding designers versus architects. Architects are licensed to perform design services, whereas designers are not. And I'm not sure about law in Oregon, but the understanding that I have is that ADUs are simply small homes and would still require a licensed professional to sign off on the drawings. And I'm wondering if that's true. or what you have, how you can address that.
Yeah, I'd kind of defer to Peter or somebody else who's an architect in California to speak up about that. So Peter, if you want to unmute yourself and answer that question as to whether you need to be a licensed architect in order to submit drawings to for like a junior ADU or not, that would be helpful clarification.
Yeah, normally in California, you don't need an architect's license to design single-family homes up to 2 stories. If you get much more than that or into commercial, you would need a license. That doesn't stop. Many jurisdictions demand it anyway, but it's not required in my understanding.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this stuff. This is just kind of looking at the environmental impacts of ADUs. And well, I'll talk about this slide for a second. There's a lot of focus, or has been a lot of focus historically, on green building technology for development. But in a study that was done in Oregon, the Department of Environmental Quality determined that among the different green building strategies out there, simply building small is in fact the most effective greenhouse gas reduction strategy among all the different strategies that are out there. So all these different things, SIP construction and recycled materials, advanced framing, these are all great. There's no problem with them, but simply building a small house, it blows everything else out of the water in terms of ecological impact. In terms of another consideration that I like to put out there really for a homeowner or developer is, you know, the other thing that ADUs inherently do is they reduce the transportation energy cost of the resident who lives there. So ADUs tend to be built in walkable, bikeable areas, and therefore, as a result, will use less energy, or the occupants will use less energy in their day-to-day lifestyle as a result of living in this ADU that's most likely located in a walkable, bikeable area, because that's where ADUs will pencil the best. And that directly translates to the energy costs of actually living in that dwelling. So if you're living in a conventional suburban development, your energy costs will be quite higher in the course of the year for transportation than your energy costs would be if you're living in a transit-oriented development. The easiest way to distill in a simple manner what the walkability ranking of an individual address is to just type in that address on walkscore.com. The higher the score, the better your energy footprint is. So when we're thinking about the siting of an ADU, there's some considerations I'll put out there right now, which is, you know, at least where we are, it's pretty important to have south-facing exposure for windows and doors to gain as much natural light as possible. But, you know, there's also other considerations. Obviously, it's a different climate in Monterey than Portland, and shading might be a consideration, more of a consideration in Monterey. Thinking about trees as a service, trees can block natural light in a good way in the summer months. And if it's a deciduous tree located to the south of the dwelling, it can let natural light through in the winter months. So that's kind of something to consider in terms of locating an ADU within a given site. And that can also, you know, help offset the heat, you know, the heating of a dwelling. So that's some considerations in terms of siting of an ADU on a property. I'm not going to go into kind of building science here, but, you know, Title 24 essentially drives high performance dwellings in California. So you're more or less compelled to do high performance dwellings in California at this point. And that's going to look at things like insulation and air sealing of a wall cavity. And then if you're looking at different heating options, I don't want to overspeak what Title 24 would or would not condone, but I suspect these are some of the options that are out there. Most commonly, I think ductless mini split is going to be the best solution for almost, like, you know, 80% of ADUs are going to want to use ductless mini split. This is where a system that provides both heating and cooling, it's highly efficient. It costs like $3,000 to $5,000 for a single head unit. It has an exterior condenser unit. And most importantly, it's giving you heating and cooling, whereas the other systems that I'll mention do not. They just do heating, radiant and floor heating, radiant wall panel. And this is something called Comfort Cove, which I'm a fan of. This is good for spaces that are like basements that don't need to have air conditioning necessarily, but produce heat. And then lastly, no matter what design or what heating system you're using, you might consider using passive solar to some extent. That is, you know, having south-facing glazing to allow for natural light and some natural heating. If you're interested in high-performance dwellings, there's a lot of interesting code or standards out there to get inspired by. The one that's kind of the most intriguing is called Passivhaus. That is a standard that comes out of Europe that looks at dwellings that can be, or buildings that can be heated simply by the occupants themselves. You yourself are a radiator in the sense that you're emitting heat. And if you build a really tight thermal shell, you can actually produce as much heat as your building needs. And so that's kind of a really nifty standard that's out there. But in any case, net zero is another more common standard. That's a building that produces as much energy as it uses in the course of a year. I suspect that a lot of homes in California are gonna meet net zero standards, including ADUs. And in general, just there's various ways to rate the energy performance of buildings, which I think would be a part of that Title 24 process. So as a quick overview of building science, green building, these are the things I think about. Location efficiency, home size, siting of the ADU, insulation, air sealing are kind of the two big things that are most important in terms of the energy use of a building. And then lastly, heating cooling systems are also really important. In Title 24 will kind of drive these topics in large part. So I'm going to pause for a second, see if there's any other questions that have come up before we continue on. Actually, let me finish 2 more slides, and then Kelly, just know that I'm going to queue up any questions that you think are relevant. Life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, obvious here that if you reduce the size of a structure, it's going to use less energy, no duh. But what isn't as obvious is that if you simply reduce the size of a structure to build it to high performance standards, it'll still use more energy than a small dwelling would. So notably though, you should think of this stuff on a per capita basis. So if 5 people are living in this 2,200 square foot house, they're going to use less energy per capita than 1 person living in an 800 square foot house might. So but the reality is most households are 1 and 2 person households. 2/3 of all households are 1 and 2 person households. So it's important that we start to think about ways to promote housing types that people actually want to live in that are sized for 1 and 2 people. When I think about the size to develop units, I generally just use like 400 square feet per capita as like an aggressive downsizing standard, because what we're living in right now in the US is like 921 square feet per capita, which is more than we really need. So I'll wrap up the building science stuff, and we'll get into ADU design best practices next. But Kelly, was there any questions that I should try to answer at this point?
We do have one question, and it's not necessarily super related to what you were just talking about, but I thought maybe it might be worth answering anyways. The question is, how can design professionals ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion within housing and planning so that ADUs don't just serve those with the most means? Any thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the question one more time, Kelly?
Yeah, how can design professionals ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion within housing and planning so that ADUs don't just serve those with the most means?
I don't know how designers do that. I mean, I think that's more of a policymaker's role, but I mean, if I was a designer and that was my goal, I would focus on garage conversions and junior ADUs, because those are going to be the most affordable forms of development. And there's so much opportunity to focus on that, to focus on internal conversions. Most architects don't like to do that stuff. That's really you know, that's a big part of the ADU market. So if I was a general contractor or a designer and I really cared about affordable housing, I would make that my specialty, because it's a big part of the market. There's not a lot of people who do it, and you could kind of make that your forte. And that's happening. And if you Google like Los Angeles garage conversion ADU, there's a lot of builders there who are doing that. They're not doing it because they care about equity per se, but they're doing it because they understand that's a big part of the market, and it is. It's a huge part of the market in Los Angeles. So, okay, so we'll get into design principles here. So this is a less relevant graphic, unfortunately, because the California code isn't necessarily so good in terms of allowing for two-story ADUs. There seems to be some confusion about that, whether two-story ADUs are actually allowed or not, based on some comments that were made by a city planner earlier from Monterey, that they might actually be allowed. But in any case, two-story ADUs, I think, are pretty important, because if you're building, say, a 1,800 or 1,000 square foot unit on a small lot, which is where most lots are going to be built, most units will be built, 5,000 square foot lots, or something akin to that. You don't really want to build a one-story 800 to 1,000 square foot structure, because it'll eat up too much of the backyard that you won't have much backyard left. And so the only way to really provide like a full one bedroom, let alone a two bedroom unit, is really to go up 2 stories. So I think from a policy vantage, it's pretty important to tackle that issue, whether it's done at the state or municipal level. I think that's something that I would say is a pretty critical aspect of ADU development that California hasn't done right yet. But if and when that is allowed, and it is allowed right now, if you attach it to the primary dwelling, then you can consider this floor plan, which is a great room on the first floor with a lofted bedroom on the second floor. Pretty simple concept. What this does is gives you a vaulted space down below. So it gives the effect of a really tall space in the first story. And then you can be in the bedroom up above and look down below, and it just makes the whole space feel huge. Kelly, you're on camera. Did you want to say something? Oh, no, okay. All right, so I'm gonna show you some pictures of what that looks like in practice when you have a small building that's 2 stories with a lofted bedroom on one side. Note that there is exposed wood beams here, kitchen on this side, staircase going up the side, storage underneath the stair. These are all kind of best practices I'll be alluding to throughout this presentation. Here's another example, vaulted ceilings, goes way up. Kitchen on this side, living room underneath the exposed wood beams. Another example, tall ceilings. Tall ceilings are one of those ways to get at making a space feel much bigger than it really is. So even if the standard is only 16 feet, you can't go up 2 stories, I might consider taking advantage of that full 16 feet simply to make that space feel bigger than it really is. You don't have to do that, obviously, but I mean, that is ultimately the #1 trick to making small spaces feel bigger, is vaulting the ceilings and making it as tall as you can. So here's another example of vaulted ceilings with a storage loft going up, a storage loft using a non-code compliant ladder to get up to it. Another example of a vaulted ceiling. You can see how tall this feels, and it just makes this small space feel quite big. This is probably like a 300 square foot room, but it doesn't feel that way when you're there. So long sight lines, you can use windows at the end of a space to connect yourself visually to the exterior. Anytime you can connect the inside of a small space visually to green space outside, it's going to make spaces feel more, I don't know, homey, nice to be in, more pleasant. And those long sight lines are a nice thing to think about when you're setting up your space with windows and getting the best view you can. French doors leading out to the patio down here, connecting you to the green space from the second story sleeping loft, looking down through this vaulted ceiling space. These are all great, iterations of this vaulted second story, vaulted ceiling with a lofted bedroom. That's the basic idea. Another best practice, just as a general matter, is high windows. High windows bring in a lot of natural light. This is a high window on the west side of a house that casts light across the whole ceiling, across the whole structure, late in the afternoon, making it feel, like light and airy, even though there's dwellings adjacent to it, not too far away. It kind of gives this natural light element to the design of the building. High windows, you can see various iterations of high windows. This is an example of skylights. Skylights are awesome. Let's say you are designing an ADU that's going to be pretty close to the setback. You're not going to have a great view adjacent to your setback because there's a fence right there 4 feet away, because you're entitled to build up to the 4-foot setback. So rather than focusing on windows at ground level, traditional windows, you might just want to get natural light. It gives you this sense of volume. It gives you this natural light and airy quality to the space. Oftentimes people say to put skylights on the north side of the building. But just in general, skylights work really well in ADUs, I'd say, especially one-story ADUs. They're almost critical. This is an example of clear story windows that are facing south. So this is another way that you can both get high vaulted light coming into a small space, but also think about this. Imagine that there wasn't a window here, and that was because you didn't want to look at this ugly, dilapidated shed that's on the property next door. You also want to preserve some privacy for the individuals in the kitchen. So clear story windows accomplish that, as do skylights. Okay, acoustic privacy. Again, if you are wanting to both create the experience of having a 1-bedroom unit, but also making a space as large feeling as possible, using some mechanism to visually close off and open that bedroom so that you can make it look vaulted or make it look more open, but also deal with this acoustic privacy issue. As a practical matter, 1-bedroom units work better when you're designing for a couple than a 0-bedroom ADU because of this acoustic privacy. If you do not have a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom unit and you're a couple and you're forced to work from home during COVID, or you're forced to, or you're just one person gets up an hour earlier than another person, forevermore, you're always going to be hearing that other person when they get up in the morning and make coffee down below. So thinking about some way to, acoustically isolate a space for sleeping from the remainder of the house is a good idea. On the other hand, it's going to inherently kind of make a space feel smaller. So there's kind of this tension between this notion of having an open floor plan and having a good living space for 2 people, which is really think of that as like the most common market for ADUs is probably a single person or a couple. And so if I'm designing an ADU for a couple, I would definitely suggest a 1-bedroom over a studio personally, for that reason alone, having lived in one for quite a while. This is how we dealt with it. We had an open cavity that led down, that you could, in the bedroom, looking down onto the kitchen below. It looked great. It was so good when it was open, but we didn't like all the acoustic mixing that was happening between the downstairs and the upstairs. So we put in double paned stained glass window, really high-end post-construction retrofit. That is, we didn't have sufficient money to do this during the construction, but a year later we did. And this, cost like $5,000 or something to design and build. But this accomplished the goal of both letting light pass through from a west-facing high window through the ADU, but also stopped the acoustic, transfer of noise from the kitchen to the upstairs. So that's how we dealt with that issue. I'm gonna stop for a second, see if there's any, Kelly, is there anything so far I should?
Yeah, so one of the questions was about, I think, one of the photos that you showed. It's asking about the great room in an attached garage. If you were to build a great room in an attached garage, but instead of attaching it to a lofted second floor, could you attach it instead to an existing second-story bedroom?
So can you do an attached bump out ADU? Is that the question, or?
I think that's the question, yeah.
Yeah, you can definitely do an attached bump out ADU. And I went over this the other day, but basically, if the code doesn't allow for you to do a 2-story ADU detached, one of the loopholes you can do is simply attach it to the primary dwelling. If you physically attach it to the primary dwelling, typically that means you have 2 conditioned spaces separated by a 1-hour firewall. Then you can use the underlying zoning base code height standards, which are 25 feet, 30 feet, and you can build a 2-story ADU in that regard. And so if you do that, then you can all of a sudden take advantage of all these tips and tricks that I've been going over with regard to vaulted spaces. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. The other question was, well, another question is the 4-foot setback doesn't assure fenestration since the building code doesn't allow openings in the wall closer than 5 feet from a property line. Is that correct?
I think it's 3 feet. Maybe I'm going to defer to a local architect, Peter, to correct me, but I thought the code said if you're within 3 feet, you cannot have windows or doors. But if you're 4 feet, I think you can. Peter, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think if it's, you need to rate it if it gets closer than 5 feet.
So you could you theoretically have a window if it's rated?
I think you can. If you get closer than that, you can. If you're on the property line, you can't have any openings.
Right.
But
So I think
We had somebody say that it is 3 feet.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
The correct
that's my
answer is,
understanding. But yeah, other architects should weigh in. I'm sure the answer is pretty crystal clear on that one. Generally speaking, fire code is going to say 3 feet. You can't do windows or doors, but I think greater than that you can. But let's let the chat room suss that one out.
And can you speak to tiny houses on wheels as feasible ADUs? Is a permit required?
Yeah, sure. So that's a totally different topic, something that very much is something I care a lot about and interested in, but as a general matter, tiny houses on wheels are not legal to live in residential properties anywhere in the United States, except for 5 jurisdictions in California that have figured out a way to classify park model RVs as forms of viable ADUs. And I would encourage all jurisdictions really to consider that option. But right now that's not an option in Monterey. The jurisdictions where that is allowed right now are Los Angeles, San Diego, big cities, Placer County, California, Fresno, California, Ojai, California. So in San Luis Obispo. So all of those jurisdictions have come up with a provision that allows for the classification of movable tiny homes, that's what they call it, as forms of ADUs, and they're classifying them as detached ADUs. That's not the approach that we do in Oregon or in Portland. What's happening right now in Portland, I think, is a little bit actually more progressive, to be honest, than that, which is right now there's an amnesty program for living in movable dwellings, basically, whether they be park model RVs or tiny homes on wheels, or that are not built to any code standard, or travel trailers or vans or even vehicles. So that's what we're doing in Portland. And that hasn't been codified into law per se, but rather it's an amnesty program that's in effect during the declared housing emergency. And so that's been underway for a few years, and that's an approach that I'm going to kind of build on here in Portland, hopefully, with, you know, get the municipality to try to build on that, because it's been pretty successful. But I think doing what these other jurisdictions have done in California is a totally viable idea, in that if you're actually concerned about affordable housing, which a lot of, you know, the California ADU conversation is, then the foundation alone is going to, you know, drive up the cost of construction by $15,000 to $25,000. So get rid of the foundation, put it on wheels, get a trailer chassis for $3,000, and you don't have to worry about that $20,000 cost. So I think it's a pretty practical approach that's driven in part by the technological innovation that's happened within the tiny house movement. So those are some thoughts regarding that. But right now, as it stands, you wouldn't be able to live in a tiny house on wheels on a residential property unless you were doing so as a form of civil disobedience. And I encourage that, but it's not really allowed.
I just want to point something out regarding the chat and Q&A feature. If you have a response to something that we're talking about, please don't put it in the Q&A, or if you have a comment on what's being said, please don't put it in the Q&A, because not everyone can see that. What you need to do is go click on chat at the bottom of your screen and change the to so that it says all panelists and attendees, and then everyone can see your comment or your response to what's being discussed. Putting it in the Q&A, only me and the other panelists will see it. So another question that we got is related to planning multiple units on a single piece of property. So when you're planning multiple units on a single piece of property for rental purposes, what is the minimum distance units need to be apart?
Good question, and I don't want to overstate my knowledge here on this one. Generally speaking, 6 feet of separation is required between 2 structures for fire code reasons, but municipalities can set their own standards in that regard. I think Monterey might be 10 feet. Again, I'll ask an architect to weigh in on that, or a planning official. I think it probably varies by jurisdiction. So if you are a planning official, go ahead and weigh in for your city and put that in the chat. But it's generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, it's going to be at least 6 feet of separation. However, jurisdictions can modify that to reduce that code. If you say explicitly in the code that the 2 structures have to have fire-rated wall assemblies, you can actually reduce that down to as little as 3 feet. That's another code advancement I would encourage jurisdictions to consider. If you want to make it easier for people to build ADUs, any flexibility that you can put into the code is going to enable that. And that's a good example of the type of code flexibility that jurisdictions should consider to go above and beyond what the state might insist upon.
Okay, and then we have a question related to utilities. The question is, since the ADU will use much less energy, water, and utilities in general, how can that be reflected in the utility bills for the property? Is it easy to track what is being used by the main house as opposed to what's being used by the ADU, so that the tenant is actually paying what they're using?
We'll just do a section in a little bit on utilities, so I'll just wait and I'll answer that question at that point. All right, so I'm going to continue on this. So we'll go, just so everybody knows, we'll go through design best practices and we'll get into utilities basically. All right, so French doors, large windows that lead to the green space. This is another best practice, ADU specific. French doors leading to garden in the back. Do it. Always a good idea. If you can do it, it's always great for a range of reasons. And this is another sliding glass doors leading out to the back. Glass doors leading out to a deck. Decks aren't counted as part of the square footage necessarily, or of the habitable square footage of an ADU. So if you've maxed out against your habitable square footage, you can still expand the usable space by simply not classifying it as habitable space. But outdoor space is a lovely amenity to add into any ADU because ADUs are inherently small. So covered outdoor space in particular is a really great way to enhance the livability of an ADU. More images of windows connecting you to the outdoors. This is a really interesting little picture. These are the same windows here. This is a window that is visible from the great room of this ADU looking out, and you see this lovely tree. It kind of frames this tree, but what you don't see is the fact that on either side of this window, in reality, like 10 feet away, is an ugly, dilapidated shed that's in the neighboring property. And that's because they shifted this window a little bit higher than what would be normal. And so this is a great example of how you use windows to give the illusion of grandiosity and actually obscure things that you don't want to otherwise want to see. ADUs are always going to be urban infill, generally speaking, going to be the urban infill typologies, and you're always going to be dealing with these kind of privacy issues and good views and bad views that you want to obscure. So being really mindful of that, using 3D modeling, using, standing in the backyard in ladders to determine what views you want to see, out of which windows, those are all good things to do. So, I think I would say that if I was an architect, I would definitely focus on ADUs because they're fun and exciting and challenging in every way, shape, and form. And this is one of those examples of a tactful use of a window in an ADU. Ladders, these are not code compliant means to get to a second story, but nonetheless, this is something that a lot of ADUs will do after certificate of occupancy. So kind of just being mindful that this is something that some customers might want. They might want fixed ladders, or I should say, they might want ladders, they might want alternating tread stairs. These are called alternating tread stairs, the one on the right, also known as a Jefferson Stair. And this is a way that you can access non-habitable space for storage, or perhaps, a guest room, but not a legal guest room. And practically speaking, this is something that a lot of like garage conversions end up needing to do because the garages are so small that they kind of need to use this additional space for storage or for other stuff. So just know that that is an aspect of ADU development that's pretty cool. In Oregon, they've actually legalized a pathway under the IRC Appendix Q code, which is a 2018 IRC code element that allows for sleeping lofts. And so Oregon kind of tweaked that IRC code and adopted it statewide for jurisdictions to allow for applicants to take advantage of that sleeping loft code element. Okay, so exposed wood beams. I mentioned this earlier as being kind of something I'd recommend considering within ADUs. This is because height is a really important aspect in terms of making spaces feel bigger. If you have flat drywall ceilings that are dropped below these beams, you're losing a foot of headspace. So exposed car decking is 9 feet high. And so it's not only visually interesting, but it's also just higher. And so that adds a lot of visual interest to the ceiling. And so you'll see this in a lot of well-designed ADUs where you have the vaulted space on one side, exposed wood beams on the other, and then a bedroom above. It's pretty common and it always looks great. So I would say do that if you can. This is another thing I wanted to showcase here. Without having a fixed television that's taking up space, you can nonetheless use this entire white blank wall and have this massive TV screen on it. For those people who like to watch television, Game of Thrones or whatever, pretty awesome to be able to have a huge television screen without taking up any space whatsoever. So, not necessarily an ADU related tip or trick, but it's definitely something in terms of space efficiency to think about. Exposed wood beams. Okay, so this is kind of borrowing from the tiny house / boat design concept of stacking functionality within small spaces. Here's a couple examples of that. This was a closet, or sorry, a space to the left of my fridge that I could not, no kitchen designers were willing to touch it. They were like, oh, you can't do anything with that space. And you just have to close it off for one reason or another. There's 8 inches of space or something. So I was like, I'm not gonna give up that 8-inch space. It was 3 feet wide, 8 inches. I'm not gonna give that up. I'm gonna use that for storage. And so I just put in a slider on a hinge here. Oh, sorry, on a pocket door type of apparatus. And that enabled us to put our dog food up here and put brooms in here. It's a really useful little portion of the space. So don't let space like that disappear. This is an example of a movable island within a kitchen. So when they want more space in the kitchen, the counter is on wheels, at least in Oregon. If it's fixed, you have to have electricity running to it if it's an island, but if you put it on wheels, it's deemed like a piece of furniture at that point, so you don't have to run electrical outlets to it. So that's just a little loophole to know about. This is an example of a cabinet that has storage on both sides. How innovative, just packing in more storage. This is an example of a closet that has storage that is actually behind. So this 12-12 roof pitch drops down behind the clothing here, and there's a bureau that you can't even see that's used for long-term storage because this wall drops down another 5 feet, and you can fit that whole bureau back there. And so, you know, that's a great little trick in terms of providing more storage. And that, furthermore, at least in Oregon, anything that's less than 5 feet in height doesn't count as habitable square footage, so it doesn't count against your square foot limits. Pocket doors and barn doors. So pocket doors are specifically a really good trick to take advantage of within bathrooms and ADUs, and that's because pocket doors don't use up swing space. So if you imagine this door here being swung open, it would take up quite a bit of corridor space in the hallway leading up to the bathroom. If you put it on a pocket door or barn door, it doesn't take up that swing space. A pocket door has to go within the wall, and therefore you can't as easily run electrical or plumbing within that wall. A barn door could be on the exterior facade of that wall, and therefore you could run plumbing and electrical in that door. But another thing I want to point out about bathrooms and pocket doors is, notice there's a second pocket door here. This is actually separating out where the toilet is from where the sink is and where the shower is. So you can use a pocket door to separate out. Another example I have is like a sink isn't behind any door whatsoever, but then the toilet and the shower are behind a pocket door. What that does is enables somebody to use the bathroom while another person's using the sink to brush their teeth. It just doubles the functionality of a single bathroom for a couple. Pocket doors are a really nifty trick in that regard. It doubles the functionality without using up any more space. Blank walls, I've alluded to how a blank wall can be used for art. It can be used for a projection screen. So if you are forced to have a blank wall, which, you know, architects love windows. We all love windows, but if you're forced to have a blank wall because you don't want to take it, you want to obscure a view of something you don't want to see, or you want to block sound from something you don't want to hear on that side of the dwelling, or you're building within the 3-foot setback, or you're converting an accessory structure within the 3-foot setback, or any number of other reasons, you might be left with a blank wall. And there's nothing wrong with that, because there's different ways you can use that blank wall that are quite valuable. Here's an example of a setback. You know, let's say you have 4 feet that you're working with because you're allowed to build to the 4-foot setback. This is a great use of that 4-foot setback. It's landscaped, there's chairs, you can enter into the ADU that way. And this, by contrast, is a poor use of a 4-foot setback that isn't being manicured or used in any way, shape, or form. I just point that out to say, you know, you're forced to build 4 feet from the property line, but what can you do with that 4 feet to make it useful? Can you put garbage cans back there? Can you put storage? Can you put hardscaping? Can you put maybe a couple seats, a bench, something? You know, use it. Think about how you're going to use it. Don't let it go to waste. Accessory structures. I think of, you know, detached ADUs are one subset of an accessory structure. Accessory structure is the terminology that's used to define a structure that is outside the building shell of the primary dwelling. And so accessory structures could be, say, a shed, a chicken coop, a garage, a ADU, a studio, an office, a bedroom. Those are all potentially accessory structures. So in this case, these folks built an ADU, but they were an older couple and they wanted some privacy. So I think they put a workshop in here so that they could actually each have their own space. So you can be creative. And, you know, interestingly, just as a side note, COVID has kind of driven a lot of interest in accessory structures, also in ADUs, but accessory structures are becoming a much more common thing now because so many more people are, you know, homeschooling and they need places for their kids at home. They don't need an ADU for that, but they do need a space where their kid can hang out with another kid to get educated during the day. Or maybe people are teleworking from home now and they need space to do that without disturbing their partner. So accessory structures is another kind of interesting new genre of things that we're going to see more and more entrepreneurship around. Companies like Modern Shed are really killing it right now. That focus on accessory structures. They also do ADUs, but it's not their main thing per se. Studio Shed, Modern Shed, those are two companies that do shed, high-end sheds, basically. This is an example of an accessory structure. Also, it's just a simple shed. I point this out to say, when you're converting a garage, you're going to be losing your accessory structure that you use for your lawnmowers, your grass seed, your bikes, your suitcases, your canoes. So you might very well be motivated to build an accessory structure just for storage. And that's something a lot of homeowners are going to be maybe not thinking about at first blush, but it's something they should think about, and they might want to think about that in conjunction with the development of the ADU as well, because if that shed's of decent size, it might need to be done with permits. You might need to build a foundation for it. So that should all be considered into the scope of work, and thinking forward about that stuff in advance will help the homeowner in terms of financing and all the things that come into play with development that are a little bit beyond what people might be considering at the outset of developing a housing unit. Here's an example of a creative use of if you take a building shell of an ADU, while the building itself or the habitable space of the building might be limited to a certain square footage amount, you can actually build an additional shed space into the ADU from the exterior, as long as it doesn't have an internal connection and it's fire separated from that shed. You could build that shed into the dwelling itself from the outside. That's not counted as part of the square footage of the ADU. So that's a good loophole to know about in terms of providing additional storage, long-term storage capacity for the functionality of that small dwelling. Basement ADUs, in general, recessed lights are going to be like the killer app within basement ADUs. They're always going to have recessed lights. They should, and to the extent that you can do deep windows, as many windows as possible, deep windows, those are the best practices for basement ADUs, essentially. Covered awnings. This is something that I think, or covered entries, I should say. When you have an entry, it's nice to cover it. This is more of an issue in the Northwest because of rain, but it's an issue really everywhere in the country because it's just nice to have more outdoor covered space to protect yourself from the elements, whether it's sun or rain. And there's various ways that you can accomplish that. In this case, we have an overhang, cantilever overhang. In this case, we have an awning. Here we have an awning with, solar panels tied in. And here we have just, a gabled awning over an entry. In general, covered entries, they're cute, they're charming, they provide, additional hangout space. So think about how to incorporate that in. Okay, so I'm gonna pause there. We're gonna get into utility connections next, and I just wanna see if there's any questions that we should cover, Kelly.
Yeah, so we have several specific questions about different aspects of building an ADU. Can you comment on the pros and cons of main types of heating and cooling units?
I can, but I don't want to overspeak my knowledge about the climate in Monterey. So maybe in the chat, I'll ask people who are designers in the Monterey market to weigh in. I would suggest my gut instinct would be ductless mini split all the way, almost all the time, because of Title 24, because of energy efficiency, because it provides heating and cooling, because it doesn't use any space, because it's less expensive than every other heat system. But if anybody has contradictory guidance or advice, put it in the chat, see what you have to say. Otherwise, ductless mini split is the way to go, absolutely. And that said, if you're doing a space that doesn't need air conditioning, like a basement, you don't need air conditioning per se because it's temperature regulated by the fact that it's subterranean. 5 degrees year round. Then you can get away with just doing a really lightweight electric resistance heat system if code allows for it. And so that would be Comfort Cove is the brand I would recommend because it's up high in the wall, doesn't take up space at knee level, which is where furniture needs to go. It's not a fire hazard. It's really comfortable. This place has Comfort Cove in it right now. So if there's any additional input on heat system choices, speak up now. Love to hear what people have to say about that. Okay. One other thing I'll mention, Title 24 related that I've heard about, and I'm curious if people in the chat room want to speak up on this one too, is the code more or less compels you in California to go all electric. And I guess in terms of providing a Title 24 rated water heater, that can be a challenge. The only option that seems to be perhaps an option for ADUs is, or for water heaters, is heat pump water heaters, which are really expensive and large. And so that doesn't really work very well with the ADU market. So I don't want to, I'm curious if people have better tips as far as Title 24 compliant water heater solutions for ADUs. Put it in the chat window if you do.
Okay, do you have any experience with composting toilets and the pros and cons?
No, I mean, I do, but I'm not in the ADU space. So I'd say, as far as I understand, it's not really a thing. That would be a conversation for like the natural building realm of things, but you know, you're going to be required to have a legal sewer connection for an ADU, for a sink, for a shower. And so if you're going to be required to have a sewer connection, even if the code allowed for you to do a composting toilet, which it may or may not, then why would you do it? Because you'd already have the sewer connection there. So it's just going to cost more to do a composting toilet than to just do a conventional toilet. So that would be my visceral response. But again, I encourage people to speak up in the chat window if they have differing information about that. That's definitely something that happens in like the natural building world and the tiny house world when you're not complying with code and you don't have a sewer connection, but not something so much in the legal permitted dwelling world.
During the Wednesday presentation, you mentioned using a hot plate instead of a kitchen for some ADUs, or somebody's saying that they heard you say that. Can you expand on that idea? A full kitchen can be really expensive.
Yeah. Okay, so this gets into stuff that is, and you, Kelly, if you want to make me full screen for a minute, that would be helpful because I'm going to be talking for a minute here, or I'll stop share and then.
Yeah, you have to just stop sharing.
Okay. All right. So in order to answer that question, which I think it's an important topic, so I want to spend a minute here answering it. Okay. So in general, an ADU is defined as being an independent living space with all the different things that a habitable unit has, not the least of which is a kitchen. A kitchen is defined as, when you really boil it down, it's really just the stove, oven, and the sink. That's what a kitchen is from a building code perspective. And furthermore, it's really just the actual powered connection to the stove and the kitchen sink. So there's local interpretations of this stuff, and I'm not leaving aside junior ADUs for a minute because that's a different topic. But but if you were to design a detached accessory living space, let's say a detached office in an accessory structure that was a detached office, or an accessory structure that was a detached bedroom, you could have a bathroom in that space legally. You could have a separate entrance, you could have a bedroom. You couldn't put in a full kitchen, but what you can put in are outlets to that space. You can legally, without permits, put in countertops. And without permits, if you have outlets and countertops, you can have anything you can plug into those outlets, not the least of which is a hot plate and a microwave and a convection oven and a fridge. So the rationale for doing those things is arguably not that important in the California context where ADUs are allowed by right. So this is a piece of advice that doesn't really apply in California. But if you're in a place where you have really bad ADU codes, which is the rest of the country outside of Portland, Seattle, California, and Austin, this is the way to effectively build legally with above board with permits, a permitted, not, functionally an ADU without calling it as such. You just don't get the oven and you don't get the full kitchen sink, but you could theoretically wash your dishes in the bathroom sink. So if you're trying to save money, I mean, there's no reason to pursue this really. But I think it's important at least to understand the variations here. Or the ways in which, the way that the regulators might think about this kind of stuff. And so if you are, maybe there's some reason why you can't build an ADU on your property, or maybe you want to have a second ADU and you can't for some reason or another, then you can think about, well, how do I accomplish these goals without actually classifying it as an ADU? This is kind of getting into more advanced territory that will, this will ultimately be important information eventually in California. Once you've built an ADU and you want to do a second one, and you can't do a junior ADU for some reason, but it's not important right now in the conversation. But code is getting more and more kind of, I don't know, it's getting more complicated and in a good way to allow for more small housing units. And so it's good to, you know, if you're really interested in solving these social, economic, environmental problems, what we're trying to do is build small housing types. And if you don't need to call it an ADU, but you have a single family house and you want to do like 3 or 4 housing units, you can't actually have a housing unit, but you can have bedroom suites that have all the functionality of a housing unit, less the kitchen sink and stove. So you could imagine, say, a central kitchen with 4 suites that come off that central kitchen, basically 4 housing units. Nobody ever does this, but I don't know why they don't, because it would be a great way to kind of solve for these same problems that small housing units solve for. And then you could think about innovative code loopholes like the ones I just covered. Okay, so that's...
Can I ask one more question?
Sure, yeah.
So there's a couple questions about garages, and I know one of them is probably a question for somebody who's familiar with City of Salinas, but somebody mentioned City of Salinas is requesting that existing permitted garages comply with current code, saying that existing footings does not have rebar. And if it does, then a new footing will have to be installed. No other city that I know of has such a requirement. Do you have any thoughts on that? And if anybody has thoughts on that, you can put it in the chat. And then the other question was, how is the California existing building code used for garage conversions into ADUs? Which I think would be a question for you, Cole.
Okay, great questions. Big fan of those 2 questions. So this is an area where the California code is silent, and there's a lot of opportunity to make municipal codes better with regard to garage conversions. And that is to say, right now, the California code says, yeah, you can convert your garage, but it doesn't say specifically that you are entitled to convert your garage even if it doesn't conform to current building code standards. So most garages were probably built in a time, say in the 1950s or 60s, when they didn't have foundations that go down below frost line and have footers. And in order to bring up that building footer to current building standards, it would be expensive, the same cost as doing new construction. So there would be no reason to consider doing a garage conversion. And therefore you're undermining the whole notion of creating affordable housing through a garage conversion if you're requiring that foundation to meet current building code. So as an advocacy matter, I would say you don't want to have that in the books. You want to enable people to grandfather in permitted existing non-conforming structures and convert them to habitable living space, provided they're not altering the structural shell, providing they're not adding new second, lofts that have load-bearing live loads on them. That if you're using an existing shell, even if it's not meeting current building code, we advocates would like for you, jurisdiction, to allow for that alteration of use to be a permissible use. And so if the City of Salinas is not doing that, I would say the City of Salinas should be, you should work with the building code officials to advocate for that. And hopefully you can find other jurisdictions that explicitly allow for that. I know Portland does, but I don't know locally what jurisdictions may or may not allow that. So great question. And then as far as conversion of garages to junior ADUs, this is kind of a fairly parochial standard that doesn't apply elsewhere in the country, but Peter would like to speak and I'd love for him to speak. But I'll just give my quick thoughts about this junior ADU. So Peter, come on out. With regard to junior ADUs, they can be up to 500 square feet. I think the state law says you can add up to 150 square foot addition. You have to add, it has to have its own kitchenette, but it doesn't have to have its own bathroom. You can share the bathroom with the primary house. So it's kind of this weird thing. You also can have, the city can require that you must add an additional off-street parking spot if you add a junior ADU, but not an ADU. And they also can require owner occupancy if you have a junior ADU, but not an ADU. So if it was me as a homeowner, I wouldn't probably touch the junior ADU thing because I don't like those poison pills unless the jurisdiction went above and beyond what the state code allowed. So Peter, come on out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about those topics as well. I know you've worked on some of this stuff.
Yeah, we have a current project. It's a garage conversion, single car garage conversion to an ADU that was done without permits. My client learned this when she inherited the house from her father, so it's been there for many, many years. So Salinas has required so many demands that she basically gets surrendered and say, let's turn it back into a garage to house a car instead of housing people. And one of the things they've asked for is what's called a proof of construction. So they want to have her prove her foundation and all of her, your structural system connections and everything, which is absolutely prohibitive. So I believe that the approach policy-wise should be to assume the project complied with the code at the time, and that any of the upgrades will need to apply to the codes. But particularly what you said the other day was that 75% of ADUs are unpermitted. This certainly chills any motivation by the public to get an unpermitted ADU into the city of Salinas, because it'll be a very disappointing and unfortunate experience for them.
Yep. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think as a policy matter, ADUs, pin video. Okay, as a policy matter, I think it's important to prioritize and make it as easy as possible to do conversions of pre-existing structures, non-conforming structures, permitted structures, not unpermitted structures, but structures that were permitted at some point, whether it's conforming or not to current zoning code. That is the way that from a policy lens, you can create a pathway for more affordable housing, which is ostensibly why a lot of people want ADUs. But if you're requiring that the garage has to meet current building code standards with the foundation, you're undermining that policy intention. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen here. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to get into utilities, and so electrical service, you're not required, again, I'm going to ask people in the chat room to speak up because some of this stuff isn't so clearly codified anywhere yet, at least at the state level, but I believe this stuff to be true. Okay, so you're not required to put in separate electrical panels for an ADU. You are required to provide electrical meters. You're not required to put in separate electrical meters for an ADU. You are required to put in separate you are required to provide access for the occupant of Unit A to access their own electrical panel without going through Unit B, and vice versa. So Unit B occupants must not have to go through Unit A in order to shut off their power off and on. And so the idea here is if occupant of Unit A was on vacation for 6 months, can Unit B shut off and on their own power without going through Unit A? That's what you have to think about with all the utilities. If you can't do that, it's not code compliant. If you can, it is. Okay, so metering is a separate matter though. It's discretionary, at least in Portland, and I think it's true in California too, that if you want to add a second meter, you can. And I would say as a consultant, I'd say it's probably best to do a second meter in that then you have two independent utility bills. Occupant of A can pay their own bill, Unit B can pay their own bill. The two shall not be intertwined, and it's easier administratively forevermore. On the other hand, there's additional cost per month to have a separate electrical service. But if it's a family compound style ADU, multi-generational household, then you don't need two bills because it's just one family paying the bill. And so you don't care. If you want to go that way, then you simply, let's say you have 1 meter, 2 properties, and it's not family occupied, then you could simply increase the rent of the ADU by $25, by $50, by $100, whatever it is, whatever you think is fair per month, build that into the rent, and that's how the bills could be handled. Or furthermore, I guess you could subdivide the bill and say 25% of the bill goes to you, tenant of unit B, and I'll pay 75%. So that's how you would deal with water. That's how you could deal with gas if you had it. That's how you could deal with electrical. Just want to see if there's any contradictory information that was just shared in the chat, because that would be good to know. Okay, nothing regarding that question. Okay, so these are images of gas lines running with 2 separate meters, one for the primary house, one for the ADU. The line for the ADU runs through the basement of the primary house, up through a trench, up into the ADU and into the closet where there's a water heater. So that's an example of how you would have independent metering for a gas connection if you had gas. Another picture of a 2-head electrical meter with the ADU in the back. Separate addresses. Interestingly, you must, at least in the Portland context, I assume elsewhere too, you must have street addresses that are visible from the street. And that is for emergency response. So if there is a fire in the ADU, the firemen must know how to get to the ADU without, from the street. They must be able to see that address. So that's kind of a code requirement, not for mail, but for emergency response, which makes perfect sense. Water metering. This is the way water meters work is you have water service that comes from the street through a lateral to a meter in the right of way. Then then there's a line from the meter through your property, through your front yard, to your house, up into your basement with a shut off. Then from that shut off, you're going to have a line, or actually prior to that shut off, you're going to have a line that tees off, goes through the basement, if you have a basement, leads out through a trench in the back wall of the house, through a trench up into the ADU, and then there might be a shut off in the ADU for the occupant of Unit B. Unit B, therefore, does not have to go to Unit A's basement in order to shut off the water. If they do shut off the water, it won't shut off the water for Unit A. Another way to achieve that functionality is to have shutoffs for each and every fixture within Unit B, so that Unit B can shut off their water without turning off any water for Unit A. And the only fixture that usually does not have its own shutoff that's accessible is a shower. Toilets have accessible shutoffs, sinks have accessible shutoffs, but showers oftentimes have valves that are hidden behind tile or in other enclosures. So you have to figure out a way to put an access panel to shut off that water. At least that's how it's construed in Portland. So this might be a local interpretation. And again, the stuff isn't going to be crystal clear or codified anywhere. So you as a builder, designer are going to be like dealing with code officials who don't know the answers to this stuff, but this is how it's done as a best practice in Portland, where it's been institutionally kind of codified here. So I provide a step-by-step guide to getting through the permitting process that's covered in chapter 2 of this book. If you're interested, it's also something you can download from my website if you sign up for getting email blasts from me. This is a set of schematic designs. This is a set of actual drawings. And I'm just going to go quickly through the step-by-step process of designing or building an ADU, just so people can get on the same page of what construction looks like. But it's really no different than just building a house. So breaking ground, new construction, load-bearing walls are in these deep trenches here. Concrete forms are put in, concrete is poured, cured. Gravel is put down, rigid foam insulation. This is just one form of construction. It's not the way all construction occurs. Gravel is put down, a vapor barrier is put down. In this case, we did radiant hydronic heating. So we put down rebar that went into the concrete for rigidity, and then put in S-shaped coils that were for PEX, heated water that would run through the concrete that is shown in this slide. And you notice the water is running up through the floor. So we've got that infrastructure in place. You notice the sewer is here. That's running up to it's going to run up to the second story of ultimately to the bathroom. Did rough in utilities at this point for sewer and drainage. Did rough in water, rough in, or I should say street, groundwork, electrical, groundwork, plumbing, groundwork, water. Did the infrastructure for gas, then framing begins. Then we did sheathing, weather resistant barrier around the sheathing, rough in plumbing, mechanical work, such as the water heater. Did rough in electric at this point. Then insulated the wall cavity with blown in fiberglass insulation. Then sheetrock goes up, also known as drywall. Then you mud, sand, and paint or prime the drywall. Then siding goes up, staining and sealing the concrete floor in this case. And I should note that just about now in this phase of construction is when, in my case, I took over as general contractor. So I had a GC do the weather-tight shell, but then I took over as general contractor in order to reduce my out-of-pocket expenses. And this is fairly common that homeowners will want to do this kind of thing. So that might not be your preference if you're a builder. You might prefer to do turnkey, but some homeowners are looking to save some out-of-pocket expenses by doing some of the labor themselves, and I'm one of those people. So then flooring goes in, tile work in the bathroom, painting, cabinet shelves, finished plumbing, finished electrical, certificate of occupancy, move in. Then you make modifications such as putting in an alternating tread stair to the non-code compliant sleeping loft. And that is what the construction process looks like. No different than really building a single family house. It's really the design and the permitting process that's a little bit different perhaps than the construction of the ADU itself. So that's going to wrap up today's presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if Kelly wants to feed any questions that have come up, or anybody else wants to make any comments that we want to talk about.
Yeah, so I have another question about garages. If building an ADU on top of a garage, is the existing overhead framing in the garage adequate to support the ADU? This is the example being used as a California home that was built in 1972. What are load requirements? Could garage ceiling be reinforced so that would not have to be completely rebuilt to save costs? Do you have any idea about that? Or maybe if people have thoughts, they can answer in chat.
I'm going to intuit the answer is no, it won't work. That you have to build a new foundation to support new posts that can support new joists that can support live loads on the second story, most likely. But perhaps there's a way. This is where an architect needs to be involved in the conversation, and a builder and an engineer. But that would be my guess. That would be at least what would happen in Portland. There's no way that you could add a second story without going through a lot of rigmarole, especially if the foundation wasn't meeting current building code. Anybody else, feel free to weigh in if you have contradictory guidance to that question in the chat.
Thank you. Also related to utilities, is it legal to have a utility shed separate from the ADU? This would free up living space to have hot water heaters, boilers, solar panel inverters, etc.
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I mean, I would think the answer is yes, but I've never seen that before. I've never seen a standalone shed just dedicated to utilities. What I oftentimes have seen are accessory shed space that's part of the thermal, part of the structural shell of the ADU. And that is where the utilities would be housed. Actually, that brings up a really interesting comment that I want to highlight for everybody, which is while there's obviously a high interest in building ADUs, you can also build other accessory additional space in conjunction with the ADUs. So we saw that image that I showed of the accessory or the shed that was built into the same structural shell as the ADU, but it's a very common thing for people to be interested in ADUs above a garage. Now, that may or may not be something you can do from a zoning perspective, unfortunately right now in Monterey, but maybe you will be able to if they change the code. But that's an example of the type of thing that a lot of people would do should they be allowed to do so, where the ADU is 400 square feet or whatever it is, but it's above a 2-car garage. That's cool, at least in the Portland context. But what you could do legally would be to do a workshop or garage with an ADU behind it. So it might be a 1,200 square foot structure, only 800 feet of which is an ADU, 400 feet of which is a workshop. That's totally acceptable, viable, you can do that. As far as putting a detached accessory structure and housing utilities, or say the water heater or dishwasher dryer for the ADU, I think you could do that. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to do that, but I could be wrong about that. So I don't want to overspeak my knowledge there. That would be a question for planning and zoning and building and life safety.
Okay, do you have any good soundproofing tricks for basement ADUs or shared wall situations?
No, there's no good trick, unfortunately. You kind of get what you get, and the standard solutions for this stuff, yeah, they work. I mean, they work a little bit. I have one right here. I can hear people walking around a little bit. Not too bad. Basically, the rule of thumb is this: you can't get rid of structural bass noise via footstep noise, but you can get rid of vocal oral noise. So, and that is the best you can hope for. And pretty much that's how I think about it. So if you put in acoustic, soft and sound Roxel insulation, you can get that at Home Depot. That is going to eliminate most of the noise. Then you can put in something called resilient channel. Resilient channel is like a Z-shaped metal bit that stick that runs perpendicular to the ceiling joist, and you can hang your drywall off in that. The idea here is to decouple the structural opportunities for structural noise to transfer from the upper unit to the lower unit as much as possible. And so you're doing that by not fastening your drywall directly to the ceiling joist, but rather putting in this resilient channel to vastly reduce the amount of surface area through which noise can be transferred. All that said, it didn't work that great. So I can't really testify that that works. The best solution is to have more ceiling height, put in rugs upstairs to dampen the noise, but I don't like rugs, so I didn't put them in upstairs. So you could put an underlayment if you're putting in new flooring upstairs. So I would probably focus on the upstairs. If you're renovating the upstairs, put in thicker underlayment and flooring and kind of focus on reducing the structural noise that way, rather than eating into the headroom of the lower unit, because that's where you're going to run up against problems. You don't want to kill too much of your headroom in the basement.
We have another question which was asked near the beginning, but I just wanted to address it. I think you talked about this earlier today, but people are asking about the average income of ADU residents in Portland. And do you have a resource on that, or can you just talk about what that looks like?
Yeah, let's see, it's a great question. There's very limited research on that particular question, but I think the way I would frame it is this: the same demographic of people who are able to rent a 1-bedroom apartment are able to rent an ADU. They're very comparable in price. The only difference is that it's arguably a far superior accommodation in the sense that it's on a residential property which has access to its own yard. And so you might assume that it would go for more than a 1-bedroom apartment, but there's other variables of 1-bedroom apartments that make them preferable. So I don't think that there's that much reason to believe that ADUs are necessarily solving for lower income bracket renters per se than a 1-bedroom apartment would, at least not without governmental intervention requiring that or something, or subsidizing that. But that's really what's going on. It's kind of similar to a studio apartment rental rate, 1-bedroom apartment rate, 2-bedroom apartment rate. And I will touch on something that's not, controversial here, but informal ADUs are going to be the least expensive form of housing out there. And obviously nobody wants to be we support, illegal ADUs, but but that is the least expensive form of housing available. That obviously has its own problems, but that's why I'm not so bullish on, you know, focusing so much on legalizing unpermitted ADUs, because that's the least expensive housing stock we have. So if we are forcing those to be brought up to current building code, we are forcing those very inexpensive units to become quite expensive. And so I don't know that it's furthermore, it's not adding to the actual housing stock. It's just taking the existing housing stock and making it more expensive. So I don't know that it's really achieving ultimately policy objectives that we want to achieve, other than presumably making it safer to live in. So that's a controversial thing to say, I suppose, but it's something that I want to at least put out there for consideration as people think about, you know, informal ADUs and tiny houses on wheels and stuff like that, that are in fact market rate solutions to less expensive housing options.
Speaking of affordable housing, somebody asked, most of the ADUs you showed in your presentation appear to be of a higher end quality and potentially expensive. Do you have any pictures or experience with more affordable ADU designs?
Yeah, I definitely have lots of experience with less. I mean, this ADU I'm sitting in right now is very affordable at 800 square feet, $100,000 garage conversion, internal garage conversion ADU. This is affordable. It's beautiful. So it doesn't have to be expensive to be beautiful. It's because it was a conversion. So any conversion is going to be less expensive. But you know, today's presentation was about design best practices. So, and they're generally going to be, you know, new construction, nice architecture designed, custom design build things. And that's what I was showcasing. But absolutely, there's, you know, conversions is one way. The other way is prefab modular ADUs. And among them, there's high-end prefab modular ADU companies that are not going to be cheaper. They're going to be more expensive than custom design build. And then there's some that are definitely manufactured home style things that are like, you know, big scale manufactured home developers are getting into the ADU market now. One, Champion Skyline is the biggest manufactured home company in the country. They have a product line that's, you know, just ADUs. Those are affordable. Those are going to be like $60,000 to $80,000 for the building itself. But then there's all these hidden costs, right? There's the foundation, the utility connections, the permit, the drawings, all that stuff. So it's going to maybe even double the cost to like $150,000. But guess what? That's affordable relative to custom design build. So those are the two obvious pathways that come to mind for me as far as achieving, you know, less expensive ADUs. Manufactured houses tend not to be, I mean, just from my subjective perspective, is they're not as good looking as custom design built. ADUs tend to be, but that's a subjective call. And if the driver here is to create affordable housing, then I would look at manufactured housing as the way to achieve that in a simple manner. And there's plenty of companies doing that now in California.
And then we have a couple questions maybe that Peter might be able to answer. One is, let's see, who can we reach out to advocate for two-story detached ADUs on the local level?
Good question. Peter, do you want to come out and help with any of these questions? So I would say that for that question, I mean, right now that happens to be a point of conversation that's occurring right now. So if it was me and I was in Monterey, I would be reaching out to Andy Flowers and City Council people and the Planning Commission, because that is a conversation that's underway and up for discussion. And it's something that should, you know, presumably if the City Council were actually wanting more ADUs, that would be something that they should want, but I don't think that is necessarily where they're leaning right now. So I think that would be something, if I was down there, I'd be advocating, I'd be gathering support for that, to write letters to the City Council, say we need two-story ADUs to provide more flexibility here. But like I said, the loophole here is, you know, attaching it. You can do an attached ADU and have it be 2 stories.
Hey, Cole. Peter had to run out. I work for him. My name's Teresa. I'm an architect, but I would second everything that you said. Reaching out to your elected officials is probably the best most effective way to go.
Great. Okay.
And then there is a question related to water credits. The question is, does anyone know if local jurisdictions are allowing additional water use credits for ADUs? And I can say something about this. I mean, it really depends on the jurisdiction. This is mainly an issue for the peninsula, so Seaside, Monterey, Pacific Grove, that area. City of Monterey. So first of all, I should say that one of the things is within the Monterey Peninsula Water District area, there is a moratorium on new water meters, but new water meters are not required for ADUs. Sub-metering is still allowed, but in terms of allowing additional water use credits for ADUs, you're not allowed, you can't purchase new water credits unless you live in a jurisdiction where they have water credits available for purchase. And as far as I know, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, only Seaside and Pacific Grove have them available right now. Monterey does not. So that's kind of my understanding.
Great. Okay, so somebody asked about linking to my book and website. I'll put that in the chat right now. It's just buildinganadu.com. I mean, it's super simple. And there is a discount available for the digital book if you prefer that right now through this program. But I'll put the link to the physical book that you can order online in the chat right there. All right, so Kelly, is there, you want to maybe just tee up, or if there's any final questions, we can do that. But you want to tee up what tomorrow's going to be about?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cole. And let me just figure out my video here. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for all your local insight on some of the questions that were asked today. So the last workshop of our conference is going to be taking place tomorrow from 3 to 5 p.m. and that is a workshop that is designated for city building and planning staff. And that'll be a little bit more of a open discussion where there will be some I guess open discussion available for everyone to participate in. And I just also wanted to mention about our ADU initiative. As many of you may be already aware, we have been working with partners for some time to share best practices and to promote and to strategize and promote the development of ADUs in Monterey County through our ADU advisory group, and we meet quarterly. So if you're interested in participating in that, please get in touch with me. You can email me at, I'll put my email into the chat after we're done here. And also, please check out our ADU, more information about our ADU initiative on our website at www.unitedway.mcca.org/ADU-initiative, which I will also put in the chat. So any more questions, please reach out to me. And if you are a local design professional that's worked with ADUs and has some experience in that area, whether you be a designer or building professional, I would really like to hear from you. So please send me an email as well if you're interested in getting involved in that way. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Some of you, anyway. Thanks.